Hi, I'm Marty Kelsey, one of the hosts of STEM in 30, and thanks for tuning in to the Air and Space live chat. We've got a great show for you today. We are joined by Air and Space Museum Deputy Director Chris Browne. Chris, thanks for talking with us.
Yeah, it's great to join you, Marty.
All right, now Chris, besides being the Deputy Director at the Air and Space Museum, is also a graduate of Top Gun, so we'll be talking a lot about naval aviation today. If you're tuning in, I want to remind everybody to head down to the comments section. Put your questions in there. We will get to as many of them as we can today. We're going to go 30, 40 minutes today and try to get to as many questions as we can. And I know that we've already got a couple of questions rolling in, so make sure you put them down there. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to get some shout outs to people around the country. And more importantly, we want you to try to stump Chris. Ultimately, Chris is one of my bosses, and we want to see if we can stump him today. So, Chris, go ahead and start off and tell us a little bit about your naval career.
Well, I started the Navy after I graduated from college in 1980. I went to flight school and, the commissioning source, AOCS, and then went to flight school from there. I was active duty from 80 to 87. And then I joined my fleet squadron after going through replacement air group and flight training in Pensacola. And then I stayed in the reserves from 87 until 2000.
Awesome. Now, I know that we have a plane on display out at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center that has a little bit of meaning to you. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, actually, it has a great history to it. I mean, the aircraft itself was part of a shoot down of a Libyan MiG back in 87, 88 time frame, 88, I think. And it was with the F32 out of Oceana at the time. And fast forward, I was subsequently the airport manager at Dulles Airport, and the aircraft came into Dulles to be accessioned into the collection upon the retirement of the F-14 in 2006. And having flown one of the four F-14 MiG killers at one point in my reserve career, I thought, well, I wonder if the MiG killer coming down to the museum is the one I actually flew. And I checked my logbook. And as people probably may know, that aircraft have numbers sort of like a car VIN number, and it's logged into your logbook. And so I was able to confirm in my logbook that I had in fact flown one flight in that aircraft when it was assigned to VF-32, and then subsequently, after leaving Dulles, retiring from the Airports Authority, I picked up the job at the museum, and there it is. It's a great story.
You ready to roll it out and take it for a spin?
Well, it's parked right next to the hangar doors. And yeah, I mean, these aircraft come to us as is, they fly in, and yeah, the thoughts crossed my mind a few times.
Nice. All right. So we've got a bunch of questions rolling in. One from Nick. He says, hi, I'm 8 years old and I love aviation. And you kind of answered this, but did the F-14 fight the MiG-35?
The MiG-35? No, the shoot down was MiG-23. Back in the mid 80s, but yeah, we flew up against many of the platforms, the MiG platforms, but the shoot down was a MiG-23 flogger.
Okay. Bryce wants to know, how many people are on an aircraft carrier?
It's the numbers vary. I think it gets as high as about 6,000. And I had the good fortune of being one of the aviators that got to fly off of the carrier. And when you realize, as I know, Marty, you've seen when we visited the Ike together many years later, that it's 6,000 people that are really working very hard for that sole mission of being able to launch aircraft into harm's way, if need be, to defend the interests of the country. So it was a great privilege. But yeah, it takes about 6,000 people.
Yeah, so what Chris was talking about, several years ago, we did a show all about naval aviation, and we had a phone call with the Navy, and we just wanted to go down to Norfolk, Virginia and kind of look at an aircraft carrier to do some filming. And they said, sure, but y'all want to ride? And at that point, we didn't know what that was going to mean. We didn't know if that was going to be, on a boat out to the carrier or fly out on a helicopter. And they're like, no, we're going to fly you out and trap you on the deck and then launch you back off a couple days later. And so Chris went out with us on that first scouting mission. And the thing that really resonated with all of us, just what you were talking about, how many people it takes to make that ship happen and to make all of those things work. was just absolutely stunning.
Yeah, there are a lot of formative lessons that I learned and had the privilege of experiencing in my naval career. But I think to the person, one of the takeaways is the importance of team, and it's not a singular activity. And as aviators, we often would think of it that way sometimes, but the reality is it's learning how to operate as an effective team, doing incredibly complex things, and it was a formative lesson that I've taken with me through my career, subsequent career at the Airports Authority, managing Reagan, and then subsequently Dulles, and then even in my current job. Nothing happens in isolation. It really is a team sport.
Yeah, and just bringing this webcast, you all don't see it, but there are 8 people right now involved with getting this all out to you. We've got a ton of questions coming in, Chris. We've got Fredericksburg, Virginia, Kentucky, and Davenport, Iowa, all watching. And this next question's from Iowa, and they want to know, what's the fastest that you've flown?
Well, I hate to disappoint. The high end of the aircraft was purportedly over Mach 2. Saw Mach 2 once, but tactically, speed is life, as they say, but when you're going that fast, you burn through your gas pretty quick. So you don't stay at that speed for very long. Hopefully you don't need to, but yeah, we've gotten it up to just close to Mach 2.
All right. Conley, age 7 from Pennsylvania, wants to know, how long does it take to master flying the Tomcat?
Well, one of the things to remember, particularly about the military service, and I can speak to the Navy, is that they train you based on your attitude, and they train to aptitude, sort of the Herb Kelleher Southwest model. And the idea there is that the Navy in their training will train you to do everything you need to know. And it's a very rigorous, fast paced. I mean, you got to keep up with it, but there's nothing heroic in it, but it moves very quickly, but there's a lot to cover. So I was a naval flight officer, and in my training pipeline, it was probably about a year and a half of training before I got to be what they considered fleet ready. For the pilots, it's usually a little bit longer, 2 years, and a lot of it just depends on how quickly they can move you through the pipeline. But there's a lot to cover, but it moves pretty quickly.
Okay. I think you're going to like this next question. What was your most memorable mission?
Oh, there's so many. The most memorable mission. Well, I don't know if it's the most, but there have been a lot. One of the more memorable ones that I had, I was at the time crewed with the commanding officer of the squadron, McSumnock, great mentor, great guy. And on St. Patrick's Day night of 1983, we had ejected from an F-14 that caught fire. So as we say, it was time to give it back to the taxpayers at that point. We were actually doing workups for crews. And within, I think it was 2 days later, he and I launched again. We were back in the saddle, so to speak, and we launched on a very, very long intercept of a Russian Bear bomber aircraft that was flying from Angola to Cuba. And typically you would intercept in a range of a couple hundred miles or so, but this particular mission was designed to intercept them literally over 1,000 miles from the ship. And so what it meant was, mind you, we had barely dried off from having ejected from an aircraft, and we were back in a new one, drilling out into the South Atlantic, hundreds of miles away from the ship. It was a great flight. We accomplished the mission. Some of the pictures of that mission were subsequently picked up or provided by the Navy to Time magazine, and they ran them. But I remember saying to Mick, I said, his call sign Snake. I said, Snake, if we have to jump out of this airplane, there's nobody that's going to come find us this far out in the South Atlantic. But that was certainly a memorable flight. It was a very memorable time.
Nice. All right, Max is watching. He's 8 years old in Chesterfield, Missouri, and he loves airplanes. So Max, thanks for tuning in. Chris, how many airplanes have you flown?
Actual airframes, probably about 8, but that would include some civilian flying I've done. Pilots typically, and especially test pilots, they will often fly many, many more airframes. And some of the great pilots of previous generations, Bud Anderson and some of the others, have in their logbook literally dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of aircraft. Mine isn't that rich. Most of it was in the F-14.
We got a chance. We used to have at the museum a hallway that was filled with model airplanes. It was really cool to walk down the hall and see all of these different small model airplanes. And one day, astronaut Randy Bresnik was walking down the hall, and we were with him. And he's walking along. He's like, flown it, flown it, flown it, flown it. Want to fly it? You know, it was just the smorgasbord of airplanes that he had flown. It was pretty interesting.
Incredible.
Okay, we've got Jordan, Alex, and Emmy in Warrenton, and they want to know what it takes to become a pilot.
Well, I think more than anything, a desire and a willingness to work hard at it. As I mentioned, I think earlier, there's no exceptional intelligence or heroics to it. You've obviously got to be you've got to have be physically fit and a strong aptitude. But I would say more than anything, it is a desire, it's a passion, it's an attitude, because there are going to be a lot of hard times in the course of training. It's not easy. It's not designed to be easy. And the thing that will sustain you through those hard times is preparation and a desire and a drive. But if you've got those fundamental ingredients, it's actually a lesson of life. Again, I've learned an awful lot from my naval experience, but if you've got the passion, the desire, the will, and willing to work hard at it, then you'll achieve it.
Nice. All right, we've got a couple of brothers, Tyler and Colin, and they want to know if it's scary to land or take off from an aircraft carrier.
Yes, sometimes more scary than others. I remember in flight school, we had only done daytime landings, and I thought, well, those are pretty cool, kind of, pretty a lot of fun. And the flight instructor at the time, he said, "Oh, you have no idea. Just wait until we do night work." And it's sort of, you have to do it to appreciate it. But clearly, the most challenging time for an air crew, especially the pilots, are landing aboard the ship on a very dark night in bad weather. And then you add into that the potential that you're low on gas. And as we say, the pucker factor gets up there pretty high. But yeah, some are a little bit more dicey than others.
All right, we've got, let's see, Joey, who's 10, wants to know if you like the movie Top Gun.
Ah, yes. Well, actually, I went through Top Gun right before the movie. And in fact, many of the instructors I had were actually flew in the mission in the movie itself and were advisors for the movie. So it's fun to read the credits and know the people. There are clearly parts of the movie that are made for sort of Hollywood, and as sort of having gone through it, you can look at it and poke holes in it. But I think in general, it's a great movie. I mean, it does capture, I think, a lot of the excitement and the thrill of the flying. Some of the flying sequences are pretty accurate. I think there's some antics and theatrics, though. My experience was that it was extremely professional, very hardworking. We were flying at least 2 flights a day with exhaustive pre-briefs and post-briefs and classes starting the day at 6. And there wasn't much time for volleyball and running around town. So I think that makes it a fun movie of sorts. But yeah, there were some accurate parts to it that's fun to watch to this day.
Nice. Ben wants to know how many G's you've experienced.
Geez. Ideally, when you start putting more than 6.5 G's on the airplane, you're just bleeding away energy. And typically when you get out of high G is when you want energy, and then you've bled it off, so to speak. So sustained G is probably about 7 on a tight turn kind of thing. Instant G's, it's more than that, obviously on a cat shot or on a hard turn. But you start bending metal in the airplane if you get up to 9 and 10 G's. And so the maintenance folks, they really don't like to see you come back with an airplane with 10 G's on the G meter.
Somebody wants to know if you ever got a chance to buzz the tower.
Well, I guess because it's been so long, we can kind of tell stories that today would probably get you thrown out of the Navy. But there was one flight in particular, went up to South Weymouth Naval Air Station. And up there was a big deal showing up with an F-14. It was a reserve base at the time. My family was in the area, and so when we were getting ready to leave at the end of the weekend, the tower said, "Hey, would you give us a little show?" And of course, now that's frowned upon to say the least, because it's typically aerobatic and so forth. But I'll share that we did that. We did one of these 6.5G tight turns around the field, building up knots, and then, as we said, we went straight upstairs, 10,000 feet, right through airspace around Logan Airport that had been properly cleared by air traffic. But it was a lot of fun, and it was a great spectacle for the folks on the ground. I would urge folks today, it's not something that we do in this day and age, but back in the day, yeah, we got to do a few of those things.
Nice. All right, we've got Larry in Virginia. He's 11, and he wants to know, how much room do you have to take off on an aircraft carrier, and how do you train to land on a carrier that's moving?
Great questions. That's one reason why it takes as long as it does to get through flight school, because they're throwing you all these various scenarios. But the takeoff on the carrier is measured in hundreds of feet, of course, and it's a catapult assist that gets you to your flying speed at the end of the catapult, 140 knots, whatever it might be, depending on the aircraft type. And then the same in reverse as your landing area is greatly reduced because you don't have any flare, you don't have a runway, you basically have a landing spot that gets you hopefully into the wires to the point where you hook one of the 3 or 4 wires that's set up. So the moving deck is particularly difficult for pilots. There's a thing called a Fresnel lens, a visual landing aid on the ship that compensates for the roll of the ship, if you will. But the reality is you'll be flying a glide path down towards the point on the ship. But mind you, the ship is indeed moving, and it may be rolling. And so you can fly a perfect pass, and the ship rolls or something happens, and you get what's called bolter. You end up having to go back around. So you don't always get aboard the first time, and sometimes it takes a few times to get around.
If you want to see what that's like, you can head over to the STEM in 30 Facebook page. We've posted a couple of videos there. We may be able to put them down in the links as well. One of them, we were able to put a 360 video camera inside the cockpit of an F-18 as it took off and went around. And then another video is myself, my co-host Beth, strapped into the back of a COD, the airplane that we rode out there on. One of us kind of screamed a little bit the whole time during takeoff. I'll let you watch that video to figure out which one of us that was. Okay, so we've got Mimi and Lucas from Raleigh, North Carolina, and they want to know if you have a favorite movie or book as it relates to flying these missions that's like exciting and accurate.
Oh, wow, that's a great question, and I may have to come back, Marty, and post something on that. There have been a lot of books written on it. There was it's probably in my bookcase back here, a book written by Wilson, who at the time, this goes back into the 80s, who was with the Washington Post at the time. And he basically embedded with the squadron for a year and went on deployment. And so he wrote the book from, I think it may be called Super Carrier, in fact. We'll have to check that, but his last name is Wilson. And that's a great book. Another book that I really enjoyed sort of at the time by Tom Clancy called Red Storm Rising. And that really is a book that's pretty well researched and sort of describes a lot of what we were trying to do in the 80s vis-a-vis the Soviet threat. And he plays out a scenario as if it had unfolded. And so that's a fun book to read. I have that one also here on the shelf.
Awesome. And we will post the link after a while. There was an article in the Smithsonian magazine about our trip out to the aircraft carrier and the filming that we did out there. So we'll post the link so that you can see that as well. Declan from DC wants to know, how long would it take an aircraft carrier to sail around the world?
Oh, gosh. I didn't know. I just landed and took off of them. Yeah, they did move around. The amazing thing about the aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy is that they're nuclear powered, and they can literally stay at sea for years and years and years. And so I'm sure it's measured in days, weeks, of course. Was it 24,000 miles or something? And they got to navigate a lot of waterways. But certainly I can't think of another ship that could circumvent go around the planet as fast, unrefueled as a Nimitz class carrier. One of the things I may add, if I can, Marty, is that what allows the carriers to stay at sea like this is underway replenishment by the other supply ships in the Navy. And that in itself is an amazing feat. Certainly, to my way of thinking and knowledge, there's no Navy in the world that can keep itself at sea, going in harm's way if need be, like the US Navy. I mean, it's really remarkable when you think that everything you would need, from fuel for the aircraft, provisions, armaments, everything you ever need, constantly get underway, replenished when you're underway. And it's really a remarkable attribute of the US Navy that makes these carrier groups endure these long stints at sea.
Awesome. All right, we've got a kid age 14, and they would like to be a pilot in the U.S. military. Do you have any tips to help them get there?
Well, of course, I'm a proponent of the U.S. Navy, but any of our sister services, of course. As I think I mentioned, probably the key thing is a passion and a desire, because that's what will sustain you through some of the toughest, longest nights of studying. You know, we go through all these training flights, and invariably, even among the best pilots and crews, you fail a flight, and it can be incredibly demoralizing. But your ability to take on the failure, learn from it, and achieve higher levels is what it's about. So I wouldn't be intimidated by it. I would say go for it. And stay focused and don't let yourself get behind. I've seen that happen where some people sort of max relax for a while and they get behind and can get into trouble fast, because whatever the military service, the flight training programs move at a clip, and you got to keep pace.
Cool. Braden, that was a great question. Thanks for sending it in. Camden wants to know what the black and white pole behind you is, and does it have anything to do with flying?
Yeah, actually that's a tail hook from an A4. Which was one of the aircraft that I learned to fly in. It was the advanced jet trainer back when I was flying in the 80s. And you can actually buy these things. I picked it up from a guy out in Arizona, but it's a fun memento. And as long as you mention it, Marty, also on that back wall at the top is a face curtain off a Martin Baker ejection seat. I don't know that it was ever used, but again, I got it from a dealer, and then some various plaques. And then I guess it's probably worth noting the flag, which was provided to me on retirement. And that, of course, is something very near and dear to all of us.
That's cool. Ian, age 12, wants to know if it was painful to eject.
It was, I would describe it as violent. It was not painful, particularly at the time. There were some bruising that occurred, subsequently that you kind of discover. I ended up, the ejection is a pretty strenuous process. And sadly, to this day, at this point, I've got some neck issues that I'm contending with that the doctor says they're accelerating. I'm aging, but it's accelerating because of the ejection. But no, I was conscious throughout the ejection. It was at night, but everything worked as advertised.
Miles, age 15, wants to know if you remember your first mission and what was it like?
I do remember my first flight in flight school, and pretty much in every airframe, and then my first FAM flight in the F-14. We were in Key West, as it turns out, down there, because based out of Virginia Beach in Oceana. Very often during the winter months when the weather wasn't as cooperative, we would have a detachment go down to Key West. So it's a great place to fly out of. And first F-14 flight, went and put it, we did about everything you can. It did even a little bit of sightseeing over the dry Tortugas, but proved to ourselves that it was pretty, take you to the limits of we talked about G's and so forth. But yeah, that was a fun flight. Never forget it.
All right, Caden, age 10, from Kansas City. Caden, I'm from Kansas City. Go Royals. They can beat up on the Red Sox.
Hey, no.
And he wants to know, who do you look up to?
Oh, wow. Um, I've been fortunate to have a lot of mentors along the way, even back into school. I think it goes without saying, I look up to my wife. Um, I, I am a spiritual person, so I do believe in God. And I've been, as I say, I've been blessed by some great colleagues and coworkers who they may not see it that way, but I look up to them. I have a great boss here at the museum now, Ellen Stofan. We have the secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. Just some real class people that, uh, yeah, they serve as mentors for me and for many others.
All right, we've got let's see, Andrew from his his great grandparents were both Navy, and they want to just thank you for your service.
Well, thank you. It's an honor.
Okay, another question about the poll. We've got so many questions coming in. Thank you all so much. Did you serve aboard any other aircraft carriers other than the Ike?
No, I CQ'd on the Kennedy, so I spent a few nights on the Kennedy. But no, I was only on the Eisenhower. Mind you, my career was 7 years of active service, but my colleagues, many of whom served full careers, would have been on other carriers and other squadrons.
Okay. Lucas and Elijah want to know, what's your opinion of the F-35 compared to the Tomcat?
Well, it's funny. People come to the museum and say, "What's your favorite aircraft?" And I say, "You really have to ask." Clearly, it's a different generation of aircraft. It's incredibly capable. I think the F-14, for what it was designed to do at that time, was first in the class. I think if you were to put it up against other aircraft today, it would reflect its age. But certainly. The F-35 is an outstanding airframe.
Xavier from Minnesota wants to know, how much do you pay attention to the landing signal officer?
A lot, because he or she is going to provide potentially instructions at the end state of the landing that, if you don't follow, can be rather disastrous. Ideally, and in most instances, the pilots make the approach, the landings, and nothing is said. In fact, believe it or not, brevity is an attribute. The less you say on the radios, the better. And it's particularly true during mission controls when you're intentionally not emitting anything. But by and large, the LSOs will refrain from audible unless it's really necessary, or a training evolution. But when they say something, yeah, you got to listen.
All right, we've got Eli from Raleigh, North Carolina, has wanted to be a fighter pilot since he was 2. Do you suggest that he gets his private pilot license first before his college or going to an academy?
I don't. Again, the Navy and Air Force and Marines are the same. The training curriculum are designed such that you don't have an hour in an airplane. So you will, in the military flying, learn everything you have to know. However, I would add that if you have that opportunity to learn how to fly before then, I would absolutely do so. I think for anybody, learning how to fly, even if all you do is learn to solo that aircraft, be it a Cessna or whatever, is a huge confidence builder and something I think is worth doing for everybody. But if you have the chance to get a few hours, much less your private license, before going to a flight program, it'll serve you well.
Okay. We've got somebody wants to know what your job is as deputy director today.
Well, I serve the director of the museum, and my job is to ensure that her goals and directives and vision for the museum are fulfilled. It's obviously a team of hundreds of us that are aligned to do that, but my job is to assist her in the museum and achieving those goals and the vision of both the museum, but then also the Smithsonian.
All right, we've got a homeschool grandmother who wants to thank you for your service, and then wants to know, how do you think the Navy has changed from the time you enlisted until now?
Well, one of the most profound things, and I noticed this, Marty, when we went back on the Ike that time, is that it is men and women. And when I was active in the 80s, the Navy was all male. And we certainly were exceptionally capable at that time, but I would add, without hesitation, that it's the strongest Navy it's ever been today. And I think it's a great advantage to be inclusive to the point of welcoming everybody so capable into the services to serve in that capacity. So to somebody of my generation, when you go back out on the ship, that's one of the things you immediately notice. But a lot of the things remain fundamental and unchanged in terms of just the esprit de corps, the focus on mission, the commitment, the attributes that I tried to learn and practice back then are the same ones today. I would say it's a better Navy today than when I was in it, and it was pretty good when I was active.
All right, we've got a question. They want to know: is the F-14 vulnerable to either faster or more maneuverable aircraft, and where is its advantage?
Well, the F-14 with its swing wing was a characteristic that no other aircraft had. The F-111, but that was some sort of a different class aircraft. We would tend to perform better at lower altitudes, if you will, as opposed to the very high altitudes. And so if we were going up against F-15 Eagles, they would want us to go up to them and we'd want them to come down to us. And that's the sort of cat and mouse of it. But the swing wing and the thrust, engine thrust, made it very formidable. It was a big aircraft. It had to carry a lot of fuel, a lot of heavy armament to accomplish its mission. So there were certain regimes where it was not quite as capable as perhaps some of the smaller, like an F-16, but fared quite well. And it typically would come down to the quality of the aircrew. I mean, if a pilot knows what he or she is doing with an airframe, they can overcome potential deficiencies in their airframe compared to others. So the machine matters, but the pilot more so.
Nice. Aiden from Baltimore, who's 10, wants to know if you ever went on any recon missions.
Recon. The closest thing that I would have done was off of Lebanon in the 80s, about the 83 time frame. It was terrible. The barracks were blown up by a bomber at that time. And so we spent a lot in Beirut. And so we spent a lot of time in the Eastern Med off the coast of Lebanon. And we had on the air wing F-14s in our other sister squadron equipped with cameras called tarps that would fly over practically into the Bekaa, but over Lebanon to take pictures and perform what you're thinking of, I believe. And sometimes those aircraft, we would have escort of those aircraft, but it was a quick flight. It was not very long, but no, my time frame of flying was sort of before the war in Iraq and so forth. So I did not have the occasion to do long reconnaissance flights.
We've got, by the way, we've got people watching from all over the place. South Bend, Indiana, Australia's sending comments, and we've got so much. We've got just a few minutes left. If you've got any comments or questions, go ahead and throw them in there real quick. But we've got Adela, who's age 8 from Southern California, and she wants to be a pilot, and she wants to know, what words of encouragement would you say to future female pilots?
Tremendous opportunity, absolutely tremendous opportunity. I think some could say that maybe the Navy and military were slow to make a decision on accepting women into combat roles. But I will say that once making a decision, the Navy, the military is all in and all behind it. You can question the decision or what leads up to a decision, but once a decision's made, there's no turning back. And the decision was, I think, correctly made. And the result today is that you would have to meet with women aviators today to really get that sense of it. But I think the opportunities are absolutely there for young women, and absolutely encourage them to follow their desire and follow their hearts, because the chances are there now. You can do things today that unfortunately were not possible when I was flying.
And if you follow STEM and 30 on social media, our next show comes out at the end of this month, or at the end of next month. It's all about World War II, but as part of that show, we talk about veteran stories, and we actually got a chance to work with a female helicopter pilot based at Joint Base Andrews, right outside Washington D.C. So you'll have to tune in to watch that. She's got a really interesting story. We've got a couple of kids asking; they want to know how high you have flown.
How high? Well, couple things. If you get above 50,000 feet, you should be in a pressure suit because some really bad things can happen to you if you were to depressurize, if the aircraft were to depressurize at that altitude. The other thing is your engines don't perform as well. At least ours didn't. I never made it to 50, but got pretty close. And the plane at that altitude is just the controllability. There's no tactical reason in our case for the F-14 to have been at that altitude, really. And if it was getting up high, it was momentary.
Elizabeth, age 11 from Baltimore. Thanks for talking with us. And Elizabeth, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
She wants to know, why should I go into the Navy instead of the Air Force?
Oh.
Putting you on the spot here, aren't we?
Well, I've got to be mindful of my audience. It undoubtedly includes some Air Force folks. So I will try to be agnostic on the one hand. I think the missions are different. Clearly, carrier aviation, if that's what you're thinking about, is unique to the U.S. Navy. And it comes with a lifestyle deploying that is different than some of our Air Force partners who are typically on fixed bases. The decision for me was made, and I was lucky. I started out by saying, I want to do the most crazy, outrageous flying I possibly can and serve my country doing so. And to me, that was figuring out how to fly on and off aircraft carriers, steaming around the world. And so part of it goes into the mission itself, and it's worth taking a look at because both services, all the services are essential in their own right. But nobody performs carrier aviation like the U.S. Navy. And if that's what you want to do, there's no better place.
Nice. Bradley, age 12. And now, Bradley, I'm going to give you a little secret here. Chris and I cannot see the pictures that you guys have been seeing. So we're going to have to wing this a little bit. But he wants to know what the thing on the bottom of the nose of the F-14 is.
It's probably what we call the chin pod, which had that TARPS camera in it. And I don't have that picture, but that's probably what you're looking for. It was a forward-looking camera that you could slave to the actual radar. So you could slave the radar to a target out there beyond your visual range and then begin to see it come into sight through that TARPS camera. Or not the TARPS is a different camera. I'm confusing terms. But that forward-looking camera was slewed primarily to the radar, but it was designed to help with beyond visual range identification. Nice.
Okay, Sam, age 10, wants to know if you're going to EAA Oshkosh this year.
Absolutely. It's funny because some people say, well, you go once, why would you go again? And I think to a lot of aviation folks like ourselves, you can't get enough of it, but absolutely wouldn't miss it.
All right. We've got a question about midair refueling. Did you do that in the Tomcat, and what was that like?
Did a lot of it. Not every hop, but most hops at sea, a lot of it based on the mission duration. And it could get kind of interesting. I mean, I think when it was most hair-raising is when you weren't practicing or in dire need of the fuel. So in other words, you could take off, we'd say hit the tanker to top off and then go do your mission. Alternatively, if you're trying to land aboard the boat late at night and it's dark and pitching deck and you're running out of fuel and now you got to go tank in order to get another look at the deck, so to speak, that can be kind of dicey because more than likely you're already stressed. You got to now go find the tanker. You got to maneuver your refueling probe to get in there. And then you hope that the tanker isn't, as we would nickname, sour. A sour tanker means, well, you're hooked up, but it's not giving you any gas. And so there were a lot of things in it that could kind of challenge you and make it interesting. But nighttime tanking was probably the most interesting.
Awesome. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to remind everybody watching that next week we have a full slate of live chats going on. We're going to have a live chat Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We're going to have two, and Thursday we're going to have another one. On Thursday, it's our normally scheduled Air and Space live chat, and that'll be Dr. Margaret Weidekamp, and she's going to be talking all about science fiction. That one we're looking really forward to. Also, STEM in 30 comes out at the end of next month on World War II. And again, the following month about volcanoes and earthquakes. And we'll be doing a live chat on the anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. So be sure you tune in there. And Chris, you actually got a chance to see a volcano, right?
I did, and I don't know if the viewers are able to see that picture, but I was flying with Mick Sumnick, the same guy that I shelled out with in '83, and we were flying by Mount Etna. We were on deployment at the time, and Mount Etna was blowing up, so to speak. And you'll notice that we were very careful not to get into the volcanic ash, but it was hard not to take advantage and take a few pictures at the time.
And those images will definitely be in our show coming out next month. And so, Chris, thank you so much for talking with us today. Everybody that watched, thank you for tuning in. We got so many questions. We're sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but be sure to tune in next week. We've got a lot of live chats, and we'd love to see those questions there. Thanks for watching.
Thanks so much.